Hey there, and welcome. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. There's something fascinating about imagining all of us connected across different places and hours, yet sharing the same story together. So if you can, drop your location and local time in the comments below, and get comfortable, because tonight we're heading somewhere cold. Not the kind of cold you feel when you forget your jacket, but the kind that bites into your bones, stiffens your fingers, and makes the air itself feel heavy. Out here, in the heart of the winter wilderness, logging camps rose from the snow like stubborn scars on the land. The men who worked them weren't just cutting trees. They were carving survival out of a place that wanted to swallow them whole. The journey to the camp alone was punishing. Days of trudging through snowdrifts, your breath freezing into brittle ice on your beard. And when you finally arrived, your home was nothing more than a drafty wooden shack, thin boards straining against the wind. Nights belonged to the rats, scratching, gnawing, skittering over blankets while you tried to sleep. Days were brutal. You rose before the sun, swinging axes until your hands bled, always one wrong cut away from disaster. Evenings brought exhaustion, but also a strange, constant tension. The scream of a frostbitten man, the crash of a collapsing roof beam, or the distant howl of wolves pressing closer to the camp. This was life for the winter loggers. Isolated, frozen, and far more dangerous than most will ever know. The journey begins long before you see the camp itself. Days earlier, you were still in the relative comfort of a town, if you can call a place with one muddy street and a drafty tavern comfort. There, you were told in low, almost conspiratorial tones what awaited you in the north woods. Endless trees, biting cold, and work that would strip the softness from your muscles until they were cords of rope. Men laughed when you said you were ready. They didn't laugh coolly more, like a man who knows a joke you don't yet understand. The trip out is not a simple walk. It's a slow battle against the winter itself. You leave on sledges drawn by shaggy, frost-covered horses, the kind whose breath comes in thick, steaming clouds. The path, if it can be called that, is nothing more than a series of ruts carved into snow, so deep it swallows your boots in a single misstep. The forest begins almost at once, and as the hours pass, the trees grow taller, older, and more tightly packed, their trunks dark against the blinding whiteness. Every sound is sharp in the frozen air. The creak of leather harnesses, the faint jingle of metal fittings, the muffled thud of boots in snow. There's a rhythm to it, and before long, you start to feel as though the world has always been this way, an endless procession of white, broken only by the dark lines of pine and the smoke-gray sky. The cold is not like anything you've known before. It is not the playful sting of a winter morning in town. This cold is alive. It works its way under your clothes, into the space between your fingers and toes, and then deeper still, into the bones themselves. No matter how many layers you wear, the cold finds the weak point, an uncovered wrist, a collar that slips open, a seam where the wind pushes through. You learn quickly not to remove your gloves even for a moment. The men who have been here before old hands, their faces wind-burned and scarred, say little, but you notice they keep their collars tight and their mouths covered even when speaking. The road climbs, though you hardly notice it until your legs begin to ache. Hills rise beneath the snow, and sometimes the sledges must be pushed as well as pulled. That's when you learn how heavy a load can be when the runners sink into powder. The drivers don't shout, they save their breath, but you hear the urgency in their voices, see the tightness in their eyes. They know that if you stop too long, the cold will claim you. It's not a threat. It's a fact. Nights on the journey are the hardest. There are no inns, no taverns, only the dark forest and the quick, brutal work of setting camp. The men carry heavy canvas tents and rolls of bedding wrapped in oiled cloth. Fires are coaxed into life with resin-rich pine kindling. The flames of fragile orange against the blue shadows of snow. Food is hard biscuits and salted meat, eaten in silence. Conversation fades early, replaced by the low hiss of wind through branches, and the occasional crack as frost bursts sap deep within the wood. By the third day, the forest changes. The trees grow even taller, their trunks wide enough that two men together cannot wrap their arms around them. The air smells different here, stronger, heavier with resin. The snow lies deeper, undisturbed by human steps. It feels as if you are walking deeper into another time, a place the outside world has not yet found. When the camp finally comes into sight, it is almost a shock. After days of nothing but white and green, the sudden shape of buildings feels strange, out of place. The camp is a cluster of low wooden cabins, their roofs weighted down with snow. Smoke curls from chimneys, dark against the pale sky. Beyond the cabins rise neat stacks of logs, each one cut and stripped, ready to be hauled out come spring. To the side, you see the outlines of sledges and saw pits, and beyond them, the beginning of a trail straight, wide, and lined with tree stumps that disappears into the forest. Your first step into the camp is onto hard-packed snow, stamped down by hundreds of boots. The ground is slick with ice in places, and you have to watch your footing. The air is filled with the sense of smoke, pine, and something else wet, perhaps, or the damp, earthy smell of men who have worked all day in heavy clothes. Men stop to look at you as you pass. They are not unfriendly, but there's a weight to their gazes, as if they are measuring you in some way. You see faces lined with frostbite scars, beards heavy with ice, eyes that seem older than the bodies they belong to. They nod slightly, but no one offers a warm greeting. Here, a man proves himself not with words, but with his ability to last. You're taken to the foreman, a broad-shouldered man with a voice like gravel. He tells you your bunk, your shift, and your tools. His words are short, not unkind, but without any wasted breath. You realize quickly that in this place, every word costs something, and men do not spend more than they must. Inside the bunkhouse, the warmth hits you first, not a comfortable warmth, but the thick, heavy heat of a room, crowded with bodies and a single iron stove in the center. The air smells of damp wool, wood smoke, and unwashed clothes. The bunks are narrow, stacked too high, each one just a wooden frame with a thin mattress stuffed with straw. Your bed is on the top, against the wall. There's a small shelf for your things and nothing else. You realize that this space will be the sum of your private world for the months ahead. The foreman leaves you there, and for the first time since you set out, you are still. Around you, men talk in low voices, mend clothes, or simply sit staring into the fire. Some glance at you, some don't. You get the feeling that until you've worked a few days, you're invisible in a way that matters. Here, survival is currency, and you have yet to earn your share. That night, you lie in your bunk, listening to the sounds of the camp. The crackle of the stove, the low rumble of snoring, the faint scurry of small feet in the walls. Outside, the wind moves through the trees, carrying with it the deep, shifting groan of trunks bending under snow. Somewhere in the darkness, far away, something calls out a long, low howl that makes the hairs on your neck rise. No one else stirs. You realize they've heard it before. And so begins your time in the frozen camp. You are no longer a traveler. You are part of a place where each day is measured in sweat, frost, and the weight of wood cut from the forest. The world beyond the trees might as well be a dream. Here, life is reduced to the simple, brutal fact of survival. And in the morning, the work begins. The first time you step inside your assigned cabin, the word home feels almost insulting. It isn't a house. It isn't even a proper shelter. It's four leaning walls of rough-cut timber, barely planed smooth, nailed together just enough to keep the roof from caving in. And even that roof bows under the weight of the snow, groaning like an old man's back. The air inside is colder than outside. That surprises you. You expect the walls to offer warmth, to trap the little heat the iron stove in the corner manages to spit out. But the gaps between the planks leak icy drafts like they were designed for it. Snowflakes sometimes drift straight through, melting on the floor and then refreezing into thin sheets of slick ice. The smell hits you next, wood smoke mixed with sweat that seeped deep into the boards. Under it all is something sour and animal-like. Rat droppings hidden in corners, the faint tang of unwashed clothes hanging from nails in the walls. The floor is bare wood, the grain polished smooth where boots have scuffed it for years, and cracked where the knots have loosened and fallen away. 12 bunks are crammed into the space, stacked 3 high along 2 of the walls. The ladders are just nailed planks, worn smooth by calloused hands. Whoever gets the top bunk wakes each morning with their breath condensing against the frost-covered roof beams. The bottom bunks are warmer, but closer to the scurrying of rats. No one wants the middle bunk, too low to sit up straight, too high to step down easily in the dark. You notice the stove right away, because it's the only thing standing between you and death from cold. It's an old, blackened cylinder patched with sheet metal where it's rusted through. The door doesn't close properly, so you hear it clink with each gust of wind. A pile of split logs sits beside it, though you're warned not to burn too much. Firewood takes time to gather, and the foreman decides how much each cabin gets. That means long stretches where the fire goes cold, and you huddle under a thin wool blanket, wearing your work coat and boots in bed. The men here don't talk much when you arrive. They glance at you from their bunks, their eyes measuring you. Not in a cruel way, more like they're weighing whether you're going to last the winter, or be one of the ones who vanishes before spring. You hear coughing in the corner, a deep, rattling sound from a man with a beard stiff with frost. Nobody offers introductions right away. You'll earn your place with your work, not with your words. The cabin has rules, but they're not written anywhere. You'll learn them by watching. There's one small window. Its glass clouded with frost, so thick you can barely see through it. In the mornings, the light that seeps in is pale and watery, as though even the sun can't be bothered to shine in this place. At night, the window is just a black square, the wind whispering against it. Sometimes, if the storm is bad enough, snow will blow in through the frame, piling in the sill until someone brushes it out. Your bunk becomes your only private space, if you can call it that. You'll learn to keep your belongings in a small crate under your bed. Spare socks, a pocket knife, maybe a letter from home if you're lucky enough to get one. The rest of the cabin isn't yours. The table in the center, the bench along the wall, the single shelf for mugs and tin plates, all belong to everyone and no one. At night, when the day's labor is done, the cabin fills with the heavy silence of exhaustion. You hear the rustle of blankets, the creak of the bunks, the quiet groans of aching muscles. Sometimes a man will hum a tune to himself, or whisper a prayer, or curse under his breath when a rat gets too close. Sleep doesn't come easy. The cold keeps you half awake, and the knowledge that you'll be out in it again before dawn keeps you restless. You tell yourself you'll get used to it. Everyone says you will. But deep down, you know the cabin is just another part of the test, not a refuge from the work, but a reminder that this place was never meant to be comfortable. It was meant to strip you down to what you can endure. And if you endure long enough, the cabin will stop feeling like punishment. It will just feel normal. At night, when the forest outside lay silent beneath its blanket of snow, the cabins became a place where another kind of life stirred. The men would return from the day's work, boots heavy with packed ice, their bodies aching from hours of swinging axes and hauling timber. The heat from the iron stove, fed with scraps of pine, would warm the damp air just enough for the smell of sweat, wet wool, and wood smoke to thicken. And that warmth, along with the scraps of food left behind, was an irresistible lure for the camp's most persistent residents. It started with the sound. Small, almost delicate at first. The faint scratching of tiny claws on the rough-hewn floorboards. The occasional rustle in a shadowed corner. Most newcomers thought it was the timber creaking in the cold, or maybe a piece of loose bark shifting in the fire's heat. But the older men would glance toward the dark edges of the room without a word, their faces unreadable, as if they had long ago accepted what was coming. The rats didn't hide for long. They were bold in the way. Only a creature that fears nothing can be bold. Their bodies were sleek, fur matted from crawling through damp snow tunnels under the cabins. Their whiskers twitched as they sniffed the air, eyes glittering in the low firelight. They knew this place. Every crack, every gap between the floorboards, every loose plank in the wall that let in a thin draft and a path inside. Food was scarce for the men, but the rats seemed to eat well enough. A half crumb of bread, a strip of salt pork left too long in the open. Even the grain meant for the workhorses. Nothing lasted the night without being gnawed or dragged away. Sometimes the men tried to fight back, setting crude traps from bent nails and spare boards. But the rats learned quickly. They were too many, too smart, and too comfortable in their claim over the cabin. The worst was waking to them. You'd feel a faint shift of weight at your feet or along your arm, and in that hazy, half-dreaming state, you'd think it was just the blanket pulling tight. Then the truth would come. A tiny claw catching on your sleeve, the unmistakable shape of a rat's body scurrying across you in the dark. Men swore under their breath and kicked out, but the rats only scattered for a moment before returning, their hunger unshaken. Disease followed them like a shadow. Coughs spread quickly through the camp, and some whispered that it was the rats carrying sickness from the garbage piles to the bunks. Others believed it was just the cold and the damp air working into their lungs. Either way, no one doubted that sharing a cabin with them was an unending battle you could never truly win. At night, when the fire burned low and the only light came from the dim orange glow in the stove's belly, you could see them if you stayed still long enough. Their shapes would slip along the walls, noses to the ground, their shadows stretching large and thin across the uneven boards. They moved with a kind of purpose, not skittish like city rats, but steady, as if they knew you wouldn't dare waste the energy to chase them. Out here, you learned to save your strength for the trees. Some men claimed they could sleep through it. Others never got used to it, lying awake and listening to the constant rustling in the walls. A few would mutter that the rats were like the forest itself, always there, always watching, waiting for their chance to take whatever they could. In the depths of winter, when the snow outside piled higher than the cabin windows and the men were too tired to clean properly, the rats grew even braver. They no longer waited for the dark, darting across the floor while men sat at the table or dozed in their bunks. One logger swore he woke to find one chewing at the leather of his boots, working it into strips. And yet, like so many other miseries in camp life, the men adapted. They hung food from the rafters on ropes, kept boots on high shelves, and slept with blankets tucked tight under their bodies. But no measure was perfect. The rats had lived alongside humans far longer than any logger had swung an axe. This was just their latest home, and they had no intention of leaving. By morning, the signs were everywhere. Small droppings scattered under bunks, chewed corners of bread sacks, a faint musky smell that lingered no matter how much smoke the stove poured into the air. The men would curse as they found their rations smaller than they'd left them, but there was no choice except to carry on. Out here, even the smallest enemy could wear you down, one sleepless night at a time. The darkness outside hadn't yet loosened its grip on the forest when the first clang of the cook's bell rang out across the camp. The sound was hollow, metallic, and somehow urgent, as if it were calling not for a meal, but for the gathering of men before a trial. The frostbitten air carried the echo between the cabins, slipping through the cracks in the wooden walls. and into the ears of the sleeping loggers. Most were already half awake anyway. You rarely slept deeply, here not with this gnaw of cold in your bones, and the occasional rat skittering across the rafters. You swung your legs over the side of your bunk, boots stiff with yesterday's frost. They were cold as stone, and pulling them on was like shoving your feet into ice buckets. The cabin floor creaked under the shifting weight of men rising in the dim light, each moving with the slow, mechanical rhythm of bodies that had done this routine 100 mornings before. Nobody spoke much at this hour. Words came later, once the heat from the coffee burned away the morning silence. Stepping outside, the shock of cold was enough to make your teeth clench. Your breath plumed in white bursts, dissolving instantly into the still, frozen air. The snow crunched sharply. Beneath your boots, the sound loud in the otherwise muted camp. Lanterns swung from hooks outside the mess hall, their yellow light trembling against the frost-coated windows. Inside, heat spilled from the doorway like an open furnace, though it was only the combined warmth of bodies and the cook's iron stove. The mess hall was a single long room, its wooden walls blackened with years of smoke. The air was heavy with the smell of wood smoke, salt pork, and burnt coffee. The cook, an unsmiling man with arms like tree trunk, stood behind a counter, ladling food onto tin plates in quick, sharp movements. No good morning, no pleasantries, just the clatter of utensils, and the occasional grunt when someone asked for more bread. The food was always the same. A hunk of coarse bread, a slab of salted pork that was more fat than meat, and a steaming tin cup of coffee, so bitter it felt like it scraped the inside of your throat on the way down. Sometimes, if the supply wagons had made it through the snow that week, there might be a spoonful of beans or a smear of molasses. But mostly, breakfast was about speed, not variety. The day's work demanded every ounce of strength you could muster, and the cook's job was to get calories into the men as quickly as possible before the axes started swinging. The bread was dry and cracked at the edges, leaving crumbs scattered across the long wooden tables. The pork smelled strong, almost too strong, but you ate it anyway, the salt burning into your chapped lips. Each bite was washed down with a swallow of coffee, so hot it left your tongue tingling. The heat worked its way down to your stomach, spreading a dull warmth outward, even as the frost still clung to your beard. The mess hall was a study in contrast, silent one moment, deafening the next. At first, the men ate in near silence, their eyes fixed on their plates, chewing methodically. Then, as the food took hold and the blood began to move again, conversation slowly stirred. A few jokes passed down the table. Someone cursed about the cold, earning a chorus of knowing chuckles. Another man complained about the boots he'd been issued, swearing they were made more for a corpse than for someone swinging an axe all day. But under the surface, there was a quiet urgency to the meal. Everyone knew what came next. In less than an hour, you'd be out among the trees, your body a machine of muscle and endurance, felling giants that had stood for centuries. Breakfast wasn't just food, it was fuel, and without it, you wouldn't last until midday. Near the far end of the table, an older logger named Wicks sat with his head low, eating with slow, deliberate bites. He'd been in the camps for more winters than most men could count, and he swore the only reason he'd lasted was because he never rushed his breakfast. "You choke it down too fast," he once told you, "and you'll be out there halfway through the morning with nothing left in the tank but spite." The stove in the corner hissed as someone tossed on another log, the sudden burst of heat briefly cutting through the hall's drafts. Men leaned toward it instinctively, hands splayed, soaking up the warmth before the foreman's bark sent them out the door. The cook moved between tables, refilling coffee mugs without asking, the dark liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rims. Some men carried their last cup outside, sipping it as they stood in the pale light of dawn. The forest loomed at the camp's edge, its black silhouettes jagged against the sky. The snow glittered faintly in the weak morning sun, untouched except for the narrow paths trampled between the cabins and the mess hall. In moments, those paths would stretch into the woods, marked by deep, purposeful footprints leading to the day's labor. You wiped your hands on your trousers, the grease from the pork staining the worn fabric. Your stomach was full enough for now, though the gnaw of hunger would return long before the sun was overhead. That was just the way of it. Logging didn't wait for comfort. It only demanded that you keep moving, keep working, keep cutting until the whistle called you back. The foreman's voice rang out from the yard, sharp and commanding. Chairs scraped back. Boots stomped toward the door. The warmth of the mess hall dissolved as you stepped back into the morning air, the bite of cold instantly crawling under your coat. You took a deep breath, feeling it frost in your lungs, and adjusted the axe over your shoulder. The forest was waiting. The snow was not just cold underfoot, it was cruel, a silent accomplice to every misstep and accident that winter threw your way. You learned to read the ground the way a sailor reads the sea, because a hidden ice patch or a camouflaged route could end your season or your life before the day was half over. Still, even the most careful man wasn't immune to the dangers. It was only a matter of time before someone slipped, someone swung too wide, or someone forgot the rules of the woods in a moment of fatigue. When it happened fast. One moment you'd hear the steady rhythm of axes and saws in the cold morning air, and the next, a sharp crack that wasn't from wood, a sound too wet, too sharp to belong to a tree. Injuries in the snow carried a different weight out here. A deep cut from a saw could bleed more than you'd think. The white snow beneath the wounded man turning a startling red that stood out against all the muted colors of winter. The cold slowed the bleeding. Yes, but it also slowed the man's heartbeat, his breath, his entire body, until you weren't sure if the freezing was saving him or killing him. And frostbite was the enemy no one wanted to talk about until it happened. It started as a numbness you thought you could shake off, a tingling in your fingertips or toes that you ignored because the work didn't stop for anyone. But then it deepened into a deadened, waxy whiteness that told you the damage was done. Fingers could be lost in days, toes in hours if the wrong conditions lined up. Help was far away. The nearest doctor might be in a town 2 days' travel from Camp Longer if the snow was deep or the sled dogs were exhausted. That meant most wounds were treated right there in the shacks, in the mess hall, or even on the very spot in the forest where the injury happened. The tools were crude, a rag boiled in water, a needle that might have been used to patch canvas the week before, whiskey poured on the wound until the man screamed himself hoarse. There was no talk of sterility beyond what the cold naturally offered. An infection was an invisible predator that claimed just as many men as the accidents themselves. If the wound didn't kill you outright, the fever might. Some injuries were less visible, but just as dangerous. A falling branch, the kind loggers grimly called widowmakers, could knock a man senseless in an instant. You'd find him lying in the snow, eyes open but not seeing, breath shallow and uneven. If he woke at all, he might never be the same, his speech slurred, his steps unsteady. Out here, you didn't have the luxury of recovery time. A man who couldn't swing an axe or haul a log was a man who'd need feeding without being able to earn it, and that bred tension in a place where every calorie was fought for. The worst part wasn't always the pain. It was the isolation of knowing that even if you were hurt, the work went on. You could be lying in your bunk with your leg bound in rough splints, listening to the others leave at dawn, their boots crunching through the snow as they headed back to the timber stands. The sound faded quickly, leaving you alone with the slow drip of melting ice from the roof, the scratch of rats in the corners, and the endless weight of cold. The days blurred, the nights dragged, and you measured time not in hours, but in how often someone remembered to bring you a cup of coffee or a crust of bread. There were stories passed around campfires, true or not, It was hard to say about men who'd been left behind when the crew moved to a new cutting site, unable to travel. The snow would swallow them, and come spring, all that might be found was a weathered boot or a rusted axe head poking through the thawing ground. It wasn't malice that left them. It was the brutal math of survival. Out here, the forest didn't care about sentiment, and neither did the schedule. Even the lucky ones, the men who survived their injuries, carried scars that winter didn't forgive. A crooked finger that could no longer grip a saw handle properly. A limp that turned every uphill walk into a slow, grinding climb. And there was always the knowledge, quiet, unspoken, that it could happen again at any moment. The snow under your boots might look solid. The tree you were cutting might seem predictable. But all it took was a heartbeat's mistake for the forest to remind you that it had been here long before men came with their axes and saws, and it would be here long after. Nightfall in the logging camps was never truly a relief. The cold of the day might have bitten deep, but the night brought a different kind of terror, one that didn't roar like falling trees or snap like the axes. It crept. As the last traces of light faded behind the dense forest canopy, the warmth of the men huddled in their bunks became a signal, an invitation for the rats and vermin that had made the cabins their home to emerge. The little creatures didn't just scurry. They prowled, sniffed, gnawed, and tested boundaries, and no one was safe from their tiny teeth and stealthy movements. Even in the tightest of bunks, where men pressed themselves against walls and each other for warmth, rats could find their way, slipping under blankets, crawling across bodies, stealing scraps of bread, and leaving the unmistakable stain of droppings behind. The sounds of the night squeaks, tiny claws scratching across wood, and the gnawing on whatever food or leather could be reached, became the rhythm of the dark, a cruel lullaby for exhausted men trying to sleep. Sleep was an ordeal. Every shift of the body, every restless twitch, every muffled cough could awaken dozens of tiny intruders. Men would jerk awake, throwing off blankets only to find small, beady eyes staring at them from the floorboards or under bunks. They fought back with bare hands, boots, or even the occasional swing of a fire poker. But for every rat driven away, two more seemed to appear, emboldened by hunger and the chaos of human movement. No one was untouched. Bites were common, and infections spread silently through the cold and damp cabins. The sting of a rat bite, sometimes barely noticeable at first, could swell, redden, and fester by morning, adding a new layer of suffering to already battered bodies. Hunger and exhaustion made the nights even worse. Men who had spent the day hauling logs and chopping timber with arms like iron were suddenly weak in the face of the relentless vermin. Sleep-deprived, they would thrash, mutter, and sometimes scream, not only from the bites, but from the anxiety that came with being prey in a place that should have been their shelter. Some tried to create barriers, stacking logs or hanging cloth, but the rats were clever, squeezing through cracks, climbing walls, and even swimming through sloshed water left from melting snow or spilled water buckets. The vermin knew the routine better than the men. They were awake, alert, and hungry, while humans teetered between exhaustion and dreamless nightmares. The psychological toll of these nights was immense. Men began to dread dusk, to count hours until dawn, praying for the relief that would never be total. The rat infestations became metaphors for the constant dangers of camp life, unseen, pervasive, and unpredictable. Cabin walls, once thought to offer protection, seemed to shrink as vermin ruled the night. Men whispered to one another in the dark, half to warn and half to seek comfort, their voices trembling with fatigue and fear. Sleep became a luxury, rationed and interrupted by the smallest sounds. Dreams were fragmented, filled with gnawing teeth, crawling fur, and the cold creeping into every corner of the body. The interplay between cold and vermin made the nights doubly cruel. While the fire in the hearth offered some warmth, the smoke irritated eyes and lungs, forcing men to weigh comfort against survival. Too little warmth and the cold would seep into their bones. Too much and the smoke would choke them, driving them closer to the vermin-infested corners of the cabins. Rats, seemingly fearless, took advantage of every opening, every flaw in the sleeping arrangements. They climbed over bodies, leaped from bed to bed, and gnawed at food kept under pillows or between blankets. No man could ever be certain that a rat wouldn't crawl into his mouth, bite his face, or carry away the small pieces of sustenance he had hoarded. In response, men developed rituals, small defenses against the nightly onslaught. Some shook their blankets and bags vigorously before climbing in, while others placed tins, boots, or scraps of wood as barricades along the edges of their bunks. Even so, the ingenuity of the rats often outmatched the ingenuity of men. Night after night, these routines became both a necessity and a form of madness, with some men talking to themselves, narrating their movements to keep fear at bay or to track the rats' attacks. Whispered curses filled the air, and occasional shouts startled everyone awake, spreading panic through the cabin, leaving men tangled in each other and the cold. In some cabins, the infestation became legendary. Stories of men sleeping with rats, crawling over them from head to toe, circulated through the camps, each tale more horrifying than the last. These narratives served as warnings for newcomers and as shared misery for veterans, a bond forged in suffering. Men compared bites, traded survival strategies, and sometimes, in a dark humor, named individual rats that had shown particular cunning. Yet the laughter was rare, and the nights remained oppressive, with the cold, darkness, and constant gnawing reminding every logger of the fragility of their lives in these remote, snowbound camps. As weeks turned into months, the impact of these nights compounded. Sleep deprivation eroded focus during the day, making accidents more likely when swinging axes or hauling timber. The bites themselves became a vector for infection. Some men developed fevers that left them shivering in the same cabins that were supposed to offer rest. Others grew irritable, lashing out at neighbors, and the tight quarters amplified every sound, every complaint, every curse. The combination of vermin, cold, and cramped conditions created an environment where mental and physical endurance were tested daily. By the end of each winter, the logs brought down were piled high. The cabin smelled of sweat, smoke, and rodents, and men emerged altered. Some limped, others bore scars from scratches and bites, while nearly all carried the invisible mark of exhaustion and trauma. The nights with the rats had become a crucible, shaping not only their bodies, but their spirits. Those who survived learned vigilance, patience, and a grim humor that would carry them through the next winter. And yet, beneath it all, there was a persistent awareness that any night could be worse than the last, that survival was fragile, and that peace in the logging camp was a fleeting, almost mythical idea. The terror of nightfall in the snowbound cabins was both mundane and extraordinary. Every creak of wood, every shuffle of fur, every whisper of wind against the cabin walls became amplified, a symphony of anxiety that kept men on edge. Sleep was intermittent and shallow, with dreams haunted by past accidents, biting rodents, and the ever-present cold. The cycles of fear, vigilance, and exhaustion repeated endlessly, molding a generation of loggers to endure conditions that would break lesser men. And while dawn promised a return to work, a reprieve of sorts, it offered little comfort. The memory of the nights remained. The scars, both mental and physical, lingered, and the shadow of the rats stretched long into every waking hour. The nights in the logging camps were rarely still, and when they were, the silence was deceptive, a fragile cover over dangers, both natural and human. But every so often, that fragile quiet was shattered by the midnight screams, sharp and sudden, echoing through the frozen forest and ricocheting between the crude wooden cabins where men huddled together for warmth. These screams could be caused by the simplest accident, a log rolling in the dark, a falling tree, or a misstep on the icy ground. But to the loggers, each sound carried the weight of mortal danger. There was no warning, no time to prepare, and the screams themselves became a signal. An alarm that sent hearts racing and stomachs twisting with dread. A falling tree was one of the deadliest sources of midnight terror. Even seasoned loggers, familiar with the immense weight and unpredictable motion of timber, were at constant risk. A log, perfectly balanced moments before, could suddenly slip, breaking loose under its own mass or a slight miscalculation, crashing to the ground with a force that splintered wood and flattened snow. The sound alone, a thunderous crack, a deafening crash, was enough to wake every man in the vicinity, hearts pounding as adrenaline flooded their bodies. The ensuing screams of the trapped or injured were gut-wrenching, piercing through the frozen air and carrying a clarity that made sleep impossible for anyone within earshot. Men rushed blindly toward the sound, boots crunching snow, axes in hand, but often arrived too late to prevent tragedy. Then there were the injuries, the kinds that turned the night into a waking nightmare. An axe slipping in the hands of a tired logger could sever a tendon or slice through a shoulder. A frozen rope could snap while hauling a log, sending it careening toward the worker below. In such moments, screams tore from the throat unbidden, raw with pain and panic. Comrades tried to reach the injured, to lift, pull, or stabilize. But in the darkness, their efforts were hampered by slippery snow, uneven terrain, and the looming shadows of fallen timber. Blood pooled quickly in the cold, forming a slick that could further imperil anyone who came close. These incidents were never isolated. Once one man cried out, others' attention and panic compounded the chaos, turning a single accident into a cascade of terror. Wolves, ever present in the surrounding forests, added another layer to these midnight horrors. Packs would sometimes descend silently, moving like shadows between the towering pines, drawn by the scent of humans, blood, or the warmth of the cabin fires. Their eyes glinted in the moonlight or in the flickering glow of lanterns, and their howls joined the human screams, creating a chorus that seemed to stretch endlessly through the night. Men scrambled to grab weapons, to barricade doors, to make noise in hopes of frightening the predators away. Still, the panic itself caused accidents, stumbling over logs, colliding with comrades, or slipping on ice, and the screams continued, blending fear, pain, and instinctive terror into a single, unforgettable soundscape. The psychological toll of these midnight screams was immense. Even those who were uninjured could not shake the memory of voices echoing in the freezing air, the image of a comrade pinned under a tree, or the sensation of a wolf's teeth snapping close enough to feel the wind from their jaws. Sleep became a luxury many could not afford. The mind replayed each incident over and over, each creak of timber or distant howl threatening to trigger another wave of panic. Anxiety became a constant companion, whispering that the next scream might be one's own. Men began to measure every movement during the day with extra caution, aware that fatigue, distraction, or minor misjudgment could result in screams that would shatter not only their night, but their lives. Midnight screams were also a form of communication, a grim signal to the rest of the camp. Experienced loggers learned to recognize the differences, the high-pitched scream of a trapped limb versus the guttural roar of a wolf attack, or the sudden, startled cry from slipping on ice. These distinctions mattered. They dictated whether men rushed immediately to help, prepared to defend against predators, or remained cautiously alert. Yet in the thick darkness, under the stress of cold, hunger, and exhaustion, these nuances were easily missed. Chaos often reigned, and by the time others arrived, the scene was already one of injury, blood, and grief. The physical environment amplified the terror. Snow muffled some sounds, but carried others, creating echoes that distorted distance and direction. The tall pines acted like amplifiers, reflecting screams through the forest and back toward the cabins. A man could scream in one spot, and it would sound as if the entire camp was under attack. This auditory distortion made it impossible to know whether the danger was near or far, immediate or fleeting. The mind, already frayed from long days of labor and nights of vermin, filled in the blanks with imagination, turning every shadow and sound into a threat. Injured men became a test of endurance, both physical and mental. Sometimes they were carried back to the cabins, bleeding and shivering, their cries continuing long after the initial accident. Others were left for hours, or even a full night, because there was simply no one strong enough to lift them or clear the obstacles in the snow. The fear of another accident, another scream, hung over the rescuers as heavily as the cold, creating a cycle of tension that lasted until sunrise. Even when daylight came, the echoes of the screams lingered, etched into memory, shaping how the men moved, slept, and worked in the days to follow. The midnight screams also fostered an unusual bond among loggers. While terrifying, they forced men to rely on one another completely, to rush to aid a fellow worker without hesitation, knowing that hesitation could be fatal. The shared trauma created a grim camaraderie, where stories of survival, close calls, and rescues were told in hushed tones around the morning fires. These tales served both as warnings and as morale boosters, reminding the men that, though the forest and winter were merciless, their teamwork could tip the balance in their favor, however slightly. Yet despite these bonds, each scream left scars. Sleep became fragmented. Nerves remained taut. Hands shook at the slightest sound of snapping wood or shifting ice. Men became hyper-aware, constantly scanning the forest line, listening for the faintest creak or rustle, knowing that danger was always present, and that the next scream could signal tragedy once more. Some men broke down entirely, unable to cope with the relentless nights, their screams blending with those of the injured, adding to the atmosphere of despair. In a way, the midnight screams were a dark rhythm of camp life, marking the passage of time as surely as sunrise and sunset. They reminded loggers that survival required constant vigilance, that winter, forest, and work were not to be underestimated. Each scream was a lesson in fear, endurance, and the unforgiving reality of life in these remote logging camps. Through it all, the men endured, emerging from each night hardened, wary, and more attuned to perilous dance between life and death that defined their existence. The cycle of midnight screams persisted, season after season, a haunting testament to the danger, isolation, and raw terror of life in the logging camps. Those who survived carried these memories with them, shaping the way they approached work, sleep, and even companionship. The echoes of screams in the snow became part of the camp's identity, a terrifying yet inescapable presence that bonded men through shared suffering and kept the lessons of vigilance alive in the hearts of all who dared to endure. The long months in the logging camps were not only physically exhausting, but mentally punishing, shaping men in ways that were invisible yet devastating. Day after day, they faced the same frozen forest, the same unyielding timber, and the same meager meals, and the isolation gnawed at them relentlessly. The cabins offered no refuge. Cramped, drafty, and crawling with rats, they were never truly private, never truly safe. A man could retreat to his bunk, cover his face with a rough blanket, and still hear the constant creaks, squeaks, and whispers of his fellow loggers. There was no escape from the company, yet paradoxically, there was no comfort in it either. Loneliness settled in, a quiet, insidious companion that crept into thoughts and dreams alike. The repetition of labor was a merciless force. Each day's tasks, the swinging of axes, the dragging of logs through snow, the hauling and stacking, were physically taxing, but also mentally numbing. The mind, starved for stimulation beyond survival, began to replay the same thoughts over and over. Conversations were minimal, interrupted by exhaustion, cold, or sheer necessity. Many men found themselves talking to themselves, murmuring to the trees, or imagining voices in the wind, as if the forest itself were responding. The isolation warped perception, making every shadow suspicious, every sound a potential threat. A snapping branch could be an approaching predator. A distant shout could be another logger in trouble. Or, in the mind of the lonely worker, it could be a hallucination. Paranoia became common. The men, already on edge from the constant danger of falling timber, frostbite, and wolves, began to suspect each other of negligence, sabotage, or hidden agendas. Small disputes over food, bunk space, or tools escalated in the mind. Imagined slights magnified into personal vendettas. Sleep deprivation intensified these fears. Nights were long and cold, and even the brief rest afforded in the cramped bunks was uneasy. Every creak of wood, every rustle of rats, every howl carried the potential for danger, and the men learned to react instinctively, often misinterpreting benign noises as threats. Depression seeped in as naturally as frost into the logs and cabins. Men who were once cheerful, outgoing, and hopeful found themselves shrinking into silence, withdrawing from shared work, conversation, and companionship. They stopped laughing at jokes, stopped noticing the small marvels of the forest, and stopped hoping for a change in their fortunes. The monotony, the isolation, and the unforgiving cold left a psychological void that nothing in the camp could fill. Letters from home were rare, and news from the outside world even rarer, leaving men to focus on the immediate struggle for survival. Without future prospects, mental energy drained into a slow despair, a creeping numbness that dulled both senses and spirit. Some men developed coping mechanisms, however fragile. They created rituals around work-specific ways to chop wood, patterns in stacking logs, deliberate pacing during hauling, to impose a sense of order in an otherwise chaotic existence. Others found solace in small acts of kindness, sharing a piece of bread, offering a blanket, or exchanging stories from home. These moments, however fleeting, were like flickering candles against the oppressive dark of isolation. They offered reminders that humanity still existed amidst the raw brutality of the forest and winter. Sleep, when it came, offered little relief. Dreams were haunted by the same threats faced during waking hours. The cracking of timber, the screech of wolves, the sight of a comrade injured or lost. Many men awoke soaked in sweat, hearts racing, only to confront the same cold, dark cabin. The boundaries between reality and nightmare blurred, leaving some questioning their own sanity. Hours spent alone in the forest or on the logs could be accompanied by imagined voices, phantom movements in the trees, or visions of unseen dangers lurking just beyond sight. The mental strain was compounded by the harsh social dynamics of the camp. Competition for survival, whether for food, bunk space, or the favor of the more experienced loggers, kept men constantly alert. Every interaction could be interpreted as a challenge or insult, every gesture scrutinized for hidden intent. The isolation amplified these tensions, making minor disagreements grow into all-consuming anxieties. Trust became a precious commodity, difficult to earn and easy to lose, yet necessary for cooperative work in the hazardous environment. Over time, the effects of isolation and repetitive labor became physically visible. Men lost weight rapidly, not only from poor diet and harsh work, but also from the psychological toll that reduced appetite and energy. Faces became hollow, eyes sunken, movements slower, and posture stooped. The cold intensified these effects, weakening both body and mind, creating a feedback loop of vulnerability that left men increasingly susceptible to accidents and illness. The mind, under these conditions, often turned inward, obsessing over past choices, mistakes, and regrets. Some men relived moments of failure or loss, analyzing them endlessly in the quiet of the night. Others became consumed with fear for the future, imagining catastrophes that might never come. The combination of relentless labor, freezing temperatures, isolation, and the constant threat of injury or death created a mental landscape as treacherous as the forest itself. Yet not all succumbed completely. Resilience, though tested, was present in subtle forms. Men who survived relied on routine, discipline, and the fragile bonds they formed with others. They learned to mask despair with gruff humor, to push through fatigue with stubbornness, and to find small moments of satisfaction in survival itself. Even in the harshest weeks, they could take pride in bringing down a massive log, in repairing a cabin, or in keeping a comrade alive through a dangerous night. Isolation and repetitive labor created a mental strain that lingered long after the winter ended and men left the camps. Survivors carried scars of paranoia, anxiety, and depression into the outside world, often struggling to adjust to normal life. Memories of the endless trees, the biting cold, the sound of the wind, and the screech of rats haunted sleep. The mental toll of camp life was as significant as any physical injury, leaving indelible marks on identity and perspective. Through it all, the lonely mind of the logger became a testament to human endurance. Men pushed beyond fear, isolation, and despair to fulfill the brutal demands of survival. While many succumbed to the weight of the environment and the darkness of their own thoughts, those who persevered carried with them lessons of resilience, caution, and the fragile importance of companionship. These were the unseen battles of the logging camps, fought quietly in the mind, even as axes fell and timber crashed, shaping the men as profoundly as the wintered forest itself. The psychological landscape of the logging camp, marked by isolation, repetitive labor, and brutal conditions, was an invisible wilderness as treacherous as any frozen river or collapsing tree. The men who endured it became defined not only by the strength of their bodies, but also by the endurance of their minds, surviving in a world that demanded constant vigilance, mental fortitude, and the ability to push past despair to face each day in the unforgiving snow. Cabin fever was an almost inevitable consequence of life in the remote logging camps. Men were packed into tiny, drafty cabins, sometimes a dozen or more, sharing the same cramped space with barely room to move. Day after day, they labored under the harsh winter sun, or more often, under a pale gray sky that never seemed to change. The monotony of work, combined with the cold seeping into their bones and the relentless presence of rats and vermin, wore down even the most stoic logger. Frustrations built silently at first, simmering beneath gritted teeth and curt words. Every minor annoyance, a bunkmate snoring too loudly, a stolen piece of bread, a spilled ration of coffee, could become the spark that ignited tempers long strained by exhaustion and isolation. Arguments began as muttered complaints or sharp glares, but could quickly escalate into full-blown brawls. Fists flew, shouts echoed through the cabins, and wooden beams shook with the force of bodies colliding in anger. Some fights were sparked by hunger, a desperate instinct driven by the scarcity of food, where the perceived theft of a morsel could seem like a personal affront. Others arose from accumulated stress, old grudges, or simple miscommunication, amplified by fatigue and cold. The air in the cabins became thick with shouting, the smell of sweat, wood, and unwashed bodies mingling with the tension that crackled like electricity. Injuries were common during these outbreaks. Broken noses, black eyes, and splintered knuckles were almost routine, yet in such isolated camps, medical care was minimal. A man could suffer a deep cut or a severe bruise and be forced to endure it with little more than a makeshift bandage. Some fights escalated dangerously with improvised weapons. A fallen piece of firewood, a metal tool left carelessly on the floor, even heavy boots swung in anger. The thin walls of the cabins offered no protection. The noise and violence were amplified, bouncing off wooden surfaces and startling the other occupants, many of whom were trying to sleep or quietly recover from their own exhaustion. The mental toll of these conflicts was significant. Survivors carried not only physical scars, but emotional ones. Trust eroded as men learned that anyone could snap at any moment. Friends became potential enemies in the span of a heated argument, and alliances shifted as loyalties were tested. Cabin mates who had once shared food and warmth might suddenly face each other across the room in a swirl of fists, feet, and fury. The psychological strain of knowing that safety was fragile, that a momentary loss of control could lead to injury or worse, compounded the relentless stress of daily labor and isolation. Fights also had social consequences within the camp. Leaders and more experienced loggers often had to intervene to restore order, sometimes punishing both parties to prevent further escalation. These interventions could take the form of physical separation, verbal reprimand, or, in extreme cases, forcing the combatants to do extra work as a means of discipline. Yet even these measures were only temporary fixes. Cabin fever and exhaustion remained constant companions, and the spark for the next brawl could always be found lurking in the background. Over time, the loggers developed a wary awareness of their own limits and those of their companions. They learned to manage anger in small ways, stepping outside to cool down, muttering under their breath rather than erupting, or choosing silence over provocation. These strategies were often crude, but essential survival tactics. The men realized that while a single fight could be survived, repeated conflicts risked weakening the group, leading to accidents in the forest or delays in completing vital tasks. The collective understanding that cooperation, even under duress, was necessary for survival began to shape behavior, though not always successfully. Yet not every fight ended in violence. Many conflicts were resolved through grudging compromise, humor, or intervention by a respected member of the crew. In these rare moments, tensions eased, and a fragile sense of camaraderie was restored. These episodes offered brief respites from the constant stress of camp life, moments in which the men remembered that they were not only competitors or rivals, but fellow survivors facing the same relentless cold and danger. Such small victories in maintaining peace became essential for long-term mental endurance. Even when injuries occurred, the men learned to adapt. A black eye or bruised shoulder was treated with basic remedies, often consisting of cold compresses, salves, or improvised splints. Fellow loggers would offer support, sometimes grudgingly, understanding that a wounded man still needed to perform essential duties to keep the group alive. The harshness of the environment demanded pragmatism, and petty disputes were subordinated to the larger struggle for survival. Still, the fear of confrontation lingered, and every cabin remained a tinderbox of suppressed emotions, ready to flare with the slightest provocation. The constant threat of brawls shaped daily life in subtle ways. Men walked on edge, their movements calculated to avoid accidental contact. Conversations were measured, and body language became a silent language of warning and negotiation. Sleep was often interrupted not only by the sounds of falling snow and howling wind, but by the echoes of previous fights, and the anticipation of future ones. Cabin mates watched each other closely, learning patterns of mood, irritability, and vulnerability, all in an effort to navigate the precarious social dynamics that were as treacherous as the forest outside. Despite the violence, there were lessons to be learned. Endurance was forged not just in the forest with axes and saws, but in the cabin with fists, tempers, and frustrations. Men learned patience, negotiation, and the importance of timing, knowing when to act, when to retreat, and when to assert oneself. These lessons, though learned harshly, were crucial for survival in an environment where physical danger and human conflict were equally lethal. The ability to manage anger and avoid unnecessary conflict became a skill as vital as any tool or piece of timber in the logging work. The phenomenon of cabin brawls was intensified by the extreme isolation. Men could not leave. The nearest town or hospital was days, sometimes weeks away. Any mistake or misjudgment could have immediate consequences, from escalating violence to missing critical work in the forest, which could delay essential tasks like hauling logs or preparing firewood. The knowledge that there was no escape heightened stress and magnified the emotional impact of even minor confrontations. Cabin walls were both a refuge and a trap, containing not only the men, but also the tension, waiting for a spark to ignite. Exhaustion played a critical role in the frequency and intensity of fights. After long hours swinging axes in the snow, hauling massive logs, and working in freezing conditions, the body's threshold for patience diminished. Fatigue made tempers shorter, reactions sharper, and accidents more likely. A minor jostle or careless remark could quickly become a full-scale fight. The interplay between physical weariness and mental strain created a volatile environment, where the line between survival cooperation and personal conflict was constantly tested. In some cases, fights were tragic. A misjudged swing or uncontrolled shove could lead to serious injury or even death. The danger of combat within the cramped wooden cabins mirrored the dangers of the forest outside, though magnified by the lack of space and control. A falling bunk, a sharp edge of a table, or a boot swung in anger could have fatal consequences. These incidents were grim reminders that the men were never truly safe, whether outside facing nature or inside facing each other. Despite the violence and tension, bonds were also forged. Men who survived brawls together developed an understanding and sometimes a mutual respect that transcended the conflict. Shared hardship, whether from labor, cold, or personal confrontation, reinforced the fragile sense of brotherhood. They learned to anticipate each other's reactions, to respect boundaries, and to offer help when necessary. Conflict and cooperation existed side by side, shaping the social fabric of the logging camp in complex ways. Ultimately, cabin fights were a reflection of the extreme environment in which the men lived. Physical isolation, extreme cold, relentless labor, scarcity of resources, and psychological stress combined to create a pressure cooker. Emotions boiled over, creating conflicts that were as inevitable as they were destructive. The men's survival depended not only on skill with tools and endurance in the forest, but also on navigating these interpersonal challenges with care, strategy, and resilience. Through the endless snow, the biting cold, the rats, the scarcity, and the violence, the loggers endured. The brawls, fractures, and moments of rage were part of the unvarnished reality of life in the remote camps, shaping men in ways that went far beyond physical labor. They became resilient, wary, and resourceful, forged in a crucible of human tension as much as in the frozen wilderness. The psychological and physical trials of cabin life were as integral to survival as every swing of the axe and every log hauled through the snow. Section 13, Fights and Fractures, stands as a testament to the hidden dangers of the camp, the violence born of isolation, exhaustion, and cabin fever, and the resilience required to endure not only nature's cruelty, but the volatility of men pushed to their limits. Every day in the logging camp was a delicate balance between survival, labor, and the ever-present shadow of danger. The men awoke before dawn, their bodies stiff from the frozen wooden bunks and the chill that had seeped deep into their bones overnight. The cabins, already cramped and infested with rats, offered no real comfort, and the meager warmth of a small fire did little to stave off the cold. Despite this, the loggers rose, driven by necessity, habit, and the promise of pay that, though modest, represented both livelihood and hope. Yet it was a fragile hope, measured in coin, but bought at an enormous price in physical and mental strain. The work that awaited them was merciless. Trees towered like giants, their trunks thick and unyielding, demanding every ounce of strength and skill. Axes swung with the force of sheer will, saws bit into frozen wood, and every misstep could bring crushing injury or death. Frostbite and exhaustion were constant companions, and injuries ranging from sprained ankles to deep gashes were treated with little more than makeshift bandages. The risks were severe, the labor punishing, and yet men returned day after day. The pay, when it came, seemed almost absurdly small against the backdrop of the dangers they faced. A week's wages could scarcely cover the cost of food, clothing, and basic necessities, let alone provide any sense of security. And yet, for many, it was enough to keep the camp alive, their families fed, and a thread of stability maintained in a world otherwise defined by isolation and hardship. Money was never the true reward. It was survival, pride, and the stubborn determination to endure that compelled them. Beyond the financial necessity, there was an unspoken bond that tied men to the work. They had chosen or been forced into this life of relentless labor, and abandoning it meant surrendering not only a livelihood, but also the camaraderie of men who shared the same trials. They witnessed each other's struggles, injuries, and victories, creating an unspoken pact of endurance. To leave was to risk losing not only pay, but also connection, identity, and a sense of purpose in a world that offered few alternatives. Many returned because they had no other choice. The forest and its frozen expanses represented the only tangible means to earn a living. The danger was ever present, but the promise of wages, however small, and the hope of completing another day's work became a powerful incentive. Each day's survival was a small triumph, a testament to human resilience in the face of relentless cold, isolation, and physical threat. The psychological toll of this existence was immense. Men were acutely aware that a single mistake could end their life or cripple them permanently. Yet this knowledge, rather than deterring them, instilled a disciplined respect for the work, the environment, and the team. Every action, every swing of an axe or step through the snow was measured against the risk and the reward. Life and death were intertwined with every motion, and the reward of survival and the modest pay was enough to keep them moving, keep them returning, and keep them working despite the constant threat looming over their shoulders. Even when injuries occurred, men accepted them as part of the job, patching themselves up with whatever remedies were available, knowing that absence from work meant no pay and increased hardship. There was no room for weakness or hesitation. The camp thrived only because the men endured, adapted, and persevered, often at the expense of their own health and well-being. This relentless cycle of labor, risk, and meager compensation defined life in the frozen logging camp and underscored the extraordinary courage and endurance required to face each day. The meager wages were dwarfed by the risks, the broken bones, frostbite, disease, and the ever-present threat of falling timber, but the loggers returned because the forest offered what few other places could: a chance to survive, a purpose to cling to, and a community forged through shared hardship. In this stark landscape, where survival was both literal and symbolic, every coin earned was a hard-won acknowledgement of a day survived against overwhelming odds. The knowledge of the dangers never left them. Each step through the snow, each swing of the axe, each hauling of massive logs carried the weight of mortality. Men walked a tightrope between life and death, yet the promise of a day's pay, however modest, compelled them to keep moving, to keep working, and to keep facing the frozen wilderness. Survival was the true compensation, and the meager wages were simply a tangible symbol of that victory. The camp was a crucible. It tested strength, skill, endurance, and above all, courage. Men faced the forest, the snow, the cold, and each other, knowing full well that every day could be their last. The pay was small, but the resilience it demanded and the lessons it imparted about human perseverance in the harshest conditions were invaluable. Each day survived was a testament to their determination, a fragile triumph over the relentless grip of winter and the ever-present threats that surrounded them. Despite the danger, despite the exhaustion and the cold, men returned again and again. The meager wages could not match the risk in a material sense, but they represented survival, identity, and a claim to a life amidst the wilderness. In the quiet moments, as men huddled by the scant warmth of the cabin fire or lay in cramped bunks listening to the wind and snow outside, they understood the truth of their existence. They labored not just for coins, but for life itself, for the fragile thread that connected each day to the next, and for the enduring camaraderie that made survival possible. Leaving the logging camp was not the triumphant escape many might imagine. After weeks, months, or even years spent in the frozen wilderness, walking away from the relentless cold, the crowded cabins, the ever-present rats, and the echoing screams was both a relief and a strange, haunting emptiness. The snow-covered paths that had once seemed endless and merciless now stretched behind them like a memory, a record of hardship that could never be erased. Every step away was a mixture of freedom and grief, a reminder of the men who had fallen to accidents, illness, or despair, and the moments of terror and exhaustion that had defined life in the camp. The physical relief of leaving the frozen forest, of breathing warmer air, and feeling solid ground beneath tired, frostbitten feet was almost intoxicating. Yet the mind carried the invisible burden of what had been endured. Memories of companions' screams, the gnawing presence of rats during the coldest nights, the deafening crashes of falling timber, and the endless toil of chopping, hauling, and dragging logs replayed in their thoughts like a relentless winter storm that refused to end. Even as the cabins in snow drifted behind them, the scenes of suffering and perseverance remained etched into muscle memory and bone, a constant whisper of the past. Some men spoke little of what they had seen or felt, hiding the scars in silence, while others recounted tales of survival with a mix of pride and sorrow. There was a strange camaraderie in those shared recollections, a bond that could never be replicated outside the camp's brutal confines. The camp had shaped them, forged them in a way no ordinary experience could. Leaving meant stepping into a world that had moved on, a world unscarred by frost and violence. Yet their hearts and minds remained tethered to the memories of frozen days, sleepless nights, and the fragile triumphs of survival. Even with relief came guilt, the knowledge that some companions had not made it, that lives had been lost in the icy silence of the forest, and that some deaths had been cruelly avoidable, yet unavoidable, in that harsh wilderness. Walking away was freedom, but it was shadowed by the weight of what had been endured and what had been witnessed. The snow, the axes, the saws, and the endless labor left indelible marks, creating a complex mixture of resilience, sorrow, and respect for the life that continued beyond the camp. The lessons carried forward were unspoken yet profound. The value of camaraderie forged in extremity, the unforgiving nature of isolation, the stark reality of human vulnerability in the face of cold and labor, and the unyielding drive to endure despite every hardship. Each man left with a story that was part terror, part triumph, a testament to the enduring human spirit even in the bleakest conditions. And while the forest and its frozen dominion faded from view, the memories, the rats in the bunks, the screams at night, the relentless work, the fleeting moments of warmth and laughter remained permanent companions that would never truly let them go.